If you ask me to talk about combat, I don't even think of flying. I don't even think of it. I can't, and that doesn't mean that my combat flying wasn't amazing. Obviously doesn't mean that my experience at Top Gun wasn't unbelievable. But not just in the movies, but even in reality, being a ground FAC in Ramadi in 2006, serving alongside soldiers, Marines, and SEALs in that place at that time gave me a perspective I never expected. And in the 1 year of me being out of the cockpit, that experience outweighs everything I ever did in an airplane tenfold. Not the least of which is because that's the closest I ever got to death.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear our first combat story from a Marine aviator, David Berke, who's a TOPGUN graduate and instructor as a Marine, in addition to being rated in the F-16, FA-18, F-22, and F-35. David has a remarkable story of multiple deployments, including dropping bombs in Afghanistan just weeks after 9/11. Beyond his distinguished and almost Hollywood-like time in the cockpit, David also volunteered to serve as a ground forward air controller, where he was assigned to lead Marines in Iraq alongside the Army and Navy SEAL teams, including that of Jocko Willink, in the middle of the fighting in Ramadi in 2006. Despite all the aviation accolades, David's experience on the ground provided a unique experience that he never could have anticipated. Jocko and Leif Babin reconnected with David and brought him on board to help lead training and leadership development at Echelon Front, which many of you know trains leaders at all levels at companies in every conceivable industry. David effectively hung up his uniform as an instructor in the aviation domain, to include serving as the head trainer at Top Gun, to instructing the next set of business leaders with Echelon Front. This interview is an insightful, humble, and very real perspective of what it's like to lead from the air and the ground while supporting soldiers, Marines, and SEALs. This was a really special episode from such an accomplished veteran, and I hope you enjoy this whirlwind discussion as much as I did. Dave, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us today.
Thanks, Ryan. Good to be here, man.
We've had an interesting string of aviators on the show in the past month or so. Mainly coming from the Navy or the Air Force. Obviously, we're coming from the Marine side. I think the one thing we got to start with is the call sign, because most of these guys have that up everywhere, and I did not notice it for you. So what is the story with call signs for you and the Marine Corps?
Well, as you probably know, unlike the movies, real call signs aren't very cool. So that probably is a good indicator as to why you don't know mine. Because I certainly don't advertise it. My call sign was Chip. It's not a good or that bad of a call sign. There are plenty worse, but I hold the distinction. I'm pretty sure I would like to think I'm the only one that's ever done it. I managed to knock out my own teeth with a G-suit hose, getting ready to go flying. It was back in flight school. I was flying jets, and sure people know this, but if you don't, you wear basically a suit that protects you from passing out. It's called a G-suit. On the end is a hose, and the end of it looks like a garden hose, just a round metal ring. And I magically somehow snapped that thing up into my face, knocked my own teeth out getting dressed for a flight. And I had to spend 2 weeks at the squadron waiting for the appointment at the Navy dentist to repair them with 2 chipped teeth. This is back in the late 90s. So Dumb and Dumber was a pretty prominent movie, and it looked exactly like the guy from Dumb and Dumber, but it was both front teeth. I can show you a picture sometime. And I had chipped teeth. They called me Chip, and it stuck throughout my whole career. So that's the story. Thanks for bringing that up.
Man, that's a good one, though, because people who are listening, we had Ryan Fischel on, an Air Force pilot, and his truly, he's like, I can't talk about it on the air. He called me later, and he shared it, and I was like, thank God you did. It was like X-rated. So this is tame. You could share that with anybody. That's a good one.
I can. I'll tell you offline, because you had another guest, a guy named Intake Cart Vet. He tried to give me a different call sign, but we're not going to go into that.
Oh, you know him? You know Scott?
Yeah, right. I do. I know him really well. When I was a student learning to fly F-18s, he was an instructor there. And then when he went to, you probably know this, he went to the Navy's F-35 squadron. He didn't fly the airplane, but he was there. I was commanding the Marine Corps' F-35 squadron. We shared a building together. So got to spend a little bit of time with him there too, but always stayed closely connected with him, and memorable cross country with him many, many years ago. But that's
Wait,
not
could you
something.
share? Could you share the cross
No,
country?
not at all. I can't.
All right, got it. I'll ask him about that next time.
You can do that. He'll remember it. I guarantee you, he'll remember it.
Oh, that's great. Okay. Another question I wanted to ask just before we got, kick off on the timeline here is
Yeah.
you've flown a lot of aircraft, and I know we'll go through it, F-18s, 22s, 35s, probably a host of others in training that we can touch on. But just, from an aviation nerd perspective, if you could kind of go out and get in any aircraft, maybe even timeless, like looking back, is there any one that you would just be like, God, I'd go get in that thing?
Man, it's such a hard question. So, as you alluded to, I was pretty lucky. I flew the Hornet, was my primary platform. I was dual qual in the F-16 for 3 years. So I had the F-16 and the F-18 qual at the same time. And I was literally morning F-18, afternoon F-16, flying both jets for many years, which was crazy. The Raptor is the Raptor. There's nothing like it. And the F-35 is an unbelievable airplane. Amongst those four, I give the standard answer as people say, hey, what's your favorite airplane? And I say, I love them all. Raptor. So that airplane it's a unique airplane, and I mean this genuinely. And I know you understand this too, from your flying experience, every one of those fighters, and I didn't just fly them once, I flew them all for several years. So I really got to know those airplanes well and really enjoyed getting lucky enough to fly 4 fighters operationally for as much as I did, which is crazy. There is something unique about each of those 4 airplanes that makes those airplanes really special. And what each of those airplanes did well, it is very memorable that I could get in any of those 4 and really enjoy. And I could explain what those are. I don't necessarily need to, but each one had an experience about it that I love. And so if you put me in any of those 4 jets, I would be extremely happy.
You're happy. But if you look back at like a P-51 or something, like historically,
as a Marine, listen, P-51, just an unbelievable nostalgic airplane. I was lucky enough, Jocko and I did a podcast with Bud Anderson, telling his story of flying the P-51. It is impossible not to look at that machine. But as a Marine, growing up, fantasizing about the Black Sheep Squadron, the Corsair is certainly, if there's a machine out there, that F4 from back in the day, that would be the airplane.
Badass.
No hit on the Mustang, just an unbelievable thing. But the Marine in me will have to tell you, if I had one thing to pick and I have to go back in time, that Corsair is the machine.
That is very cool. Okay, got it. And I think we will revisit, if you're okay with it in a bit, the differences between the aircraft. Because I think,
totally.
I don't know, just as an aviator, like I'm interested in it, and I know people listening love nerding out on this too. So
100%.
With that, let's go back to you as a kid. Where did the spark for aviation come in for you?
Yeah, the best thing I think that ever happened to me is I grew up in Southern California, and I think I was 5 or maybe 6, but really young in life. I moved to El Torro, and some of your listeners probably know this. There used to be a base called Marine Corps Air Station El Torro. It's long closed. It has been closed for decades. But as a kid, I literally grew up about a mile away from the Marine base. And so if I stood outside of my house every single day, my entire childhood, I was right underneath the flight line, coming back in. So I spent my childhood looking up, watching jets fly overhead. And without a doubt, that got into my blood. I don't have any military background, no parents, grandparents, nothing going on there. Fortunate enough, just happened to move there. And I think just seeing those machines, this is back in the day, A4s, F4 Phantoms. I remember when the first F-18 showed up in the early 80s. So from the late 70s on, I'm watching fighters overhead on a Marine base, and it's pretty obvious that got in my bloodstream and I couldn't shake it. And that set me on a very early age on the path. Obviously, some other critical events we can talk to, but that was the very, very beginning. Yeah,
let's talk about some of those events. And also, you mentioned no family history in the military. What were you doing next to an airfield to begin with?
It was a town called El Torro. There happened to be a Marine base there, and my dad had a job there. I don't even know exactly what it was. I mean, like I said, I was 5 or 6, so I can't piece any of those things together. But what I was able to do, because I was so close, I could literally ride my bicycle to the air show every year. And so,
That's awesome.
back in the day when, I think we were a little more liberal in what we could do with our kids, and parents were like, I'm going to the air show. And I would go to the Friday, Saturday, Sunday show at El Torro as a little kid. I did not miss a show, and I could get there independently, and I was close enough to ride my bike. So probably from 7, my parents were taking me when I was 7 or 8 years old, but by 9, 10, 11, 12 and beyond, I'm going to the show every year by myself and just getting immersed in that one weekend a year where our hometown hosted with this massive West Coast air show. Blue Angels are there, Thunderbirds are there,
That's awesome.
all the fighters and stuff. So I'm going there every year. And like I said, when you talk about things getting into your bloodstream, I couldn't help but just fall in love with those machines and have really fond memories of a very early age of being at the air show and being able to get there once a year and see that whole thing. And it was awesome. Absolutely.
You were just there on your own?
Yeah, I would say my mom
God, that's great.
My mom's taken me from 6, 7, and 8. I'd say by 10 years old, I'm riding my bike to the air show by myself, just hanging out all day. I'm not sure Child Protective Services would be on board with that, but back in the day, that's what we were doing, and it was a good time.
I've mentioned to people when I guess I must have been 11 or 12. My parents worked at the State Department, so we lived in Pakistan for 4 years, and I would ride my bike from our house to the embassy every day. And it was like 30 minutes through the center of Islamabad. So oftentimes I'm like, Mom, what the hell were you thinking? She's like, we just let everybody go then. Like, this is what you did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, that's cool. All right. So you've got, and you mentioned some other pivotal moments growing up. I'd love to hear a little bit more about those that come to mind.
It's so cliche, man, but the truth of the matter is, and I've had to tell this many times, and it's just a fact of life. Top Gun came out when I was 14. And so I think from 6 or 7 to 12 or 13, there's sort of fantasy. You look up, you see the fighter jets, you go to the air show. It's all really neat, but it's sort of out of body. You don't really make any connection to it. It seems like almost like you're watching a movie set. It doesn't seem real. And at a young age, but at 13 or 14 years old, things start to form in your head, become fairly formative. And as cliche as it sounds, that movie, in the way it was presented and seeing it on the big screen, it had such an impact that I was able to correlate this conceptual thing that was sitting out there, going to air shows and seeing airplanes that were, I guess you could call it, far away. And then this movie that, all through Hollywood, but movie made it right up there close and personal, that you could see this character flying a plane around a boat. And it was at the perfect age where I was young enough to be infatuated with it, but old enough to make the connection of, I could see if that's something people do. And within a year or two of Top Gun coming out, so that's 14, I'm now 15, getting into high school and starting to think about life. And I knew I wanted to be in the Marine Corps. I knew I wanted to be in the military, but I could really start to coalesce around it. I was able to make the connection that Marines flew planes on boats. And very, very quickly in that early teen years, fantasy very quickly became a potential reality. And it really catapulted me into getting really serious about investigating what did I actually have to do to get into this world, rather than just see it in the movies or on TV or see it at shows. And I was very lucky that it happened at the right time. If I'm seeing Top Gun at 6 or 7, I'm not making the connection. And if I'm seeing it at 25 or 26, it's too late. So I really thread the needle through pure luck that at that time, it made what seemed unreal more real. And I got on the path there and try to figure out what to do. And that's how it all started.
I think one of the key takeaways I have from having talked to so many vets now is the influence that Hollywood and books have. And I'm the same way. I've watched Top Gun so many times, so many times.
Yeah.
But a lot of people do refer to Top Gun, obviously the Aviators, but there's The Rock,
yeah,
Con Air,
Navy SEALs. You talk to all the guys I work with now.
Of course,
they'll tell you that movie was the movie.
Oh, it's just crazy that's kind of the impetus for a lot of this.
Pretty cliche, but honestly, man, hugely impactful.
It is. And I guess that's the other thing. Another thing that I've noticed over time, having talked to so many vets, especially the tier 1 and 2 operators, they were just phantoms back in the day. Like when we were younger, you just never heard about these people.
Yeah.
And now I've met them, I've talked to them, I learned they're just like everyone else. And it's like, oh, you could probably go do that. So I think it's given a new opportunity, the way you saw, like, hey, you just see a jet, that's one thing, but to connect it with a person and like a life that's behind it.
Ryan, that comment is spot on. That's a thing that I try to convey all the time, especially if there's younger folks listening, is what you see that looks like fantasy or looks like Hollywood. That person, that's just a regular, normal person.
Completely.
No different from anybody else, from you or me. And if you can make that connection and go, oh, that's just a regular person doing that thing, I now recognize that I might be able to do that. It makes it much more attainable. But I think that comment you made is a really powerful comment, to recognize that anybody that's doing anything in the world, it's just a person. There's nothing really unique about any of us in some sense, because that means we can all do the same things. And oftentimes we place things on pedestals and think, oh, it's unattainable, it can't be done, I can't achieve that. And that's a terrible approach to have, because in the end, just like you described, those incredible people doing incredible things, they're just human beings. And that means everybody has the potential of doing that. I was lucky enough, and of course, through a bunch of great influence, to make that connection at just the right age.
So actually, that brings up a separate question here. I'm going to ask you where the Marine Corps came into it, because obviously you're talking Top Gun, but you're living next to a Marine Corps base, so I get that. But if you hadn't gone into the military, what do you think you would have done for a life?
Dude, I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. I had a really narrow, single-minded approach about what I was going to do pretty early. So I never really considered or explored a backup plan. Now, there were backup plans to my ultimate goal. I wanted to fly this jet for this service. It's fully understood, even at the time, knowing there was definitely no guarantee of that. But I was going to join the military no matter what. And at some point it was, I am going to be a Marine of whatever variety that I can. And, you know, I had influences in other services. I had a lot of good friends that really wanted to be in the Air Force. My best friend, you know, considered being in the Air Force. I had some really good friends that went off to the academy, but the Marine Corps being so close, like literally around the corner, what ended up happening is, as I started working and, you know, I got a job in high school, I happened to work with a guy who was a Marine. He was an enlisted Marine, a staff sergeant at the time. I'm a 16-year-old kid working in the stock room at Target over the holidays, and this guy is doing the same thing and ends up becoming a mentor. And what he was able to make me understand is that the thing that I thought about the Marine Corps that was unique, it was. Now, I got to be really careful with that, because it's a very personal thing. You know, you join the Army, I joined the Marine Corps. The variation between someone who joins any of the services, it's so narrow. But for me, I got it in my head because of guys like Aaron Irvin and these other people who influenced my life. I got it in my head that the Marines were special. And of course, all Marines think that. I've come to find out that all the services are amazing. They're all incredible. But I put the Marine Corps, I figured the Marines are just special. They're just a little bit better, a little bit tougher. That's my 14, 15-year-old brain. And so I got it in my head that if I could be a Marine, I could do anything. So when I pieced it together that I could be a Marine, I could be a fighter pilot, I could land on boats, and all these things pieced together that it was a possibility, very, very narrow possibility, man, all the things I ever wanted, they all existed together, which was super cool. And I put the Marine Corps on a pedestal. I wanted to say I was a Marine.
I hear this so often and completely understood. My uncle is a retired Marine colonel, so I hear this a lot also from him. My old man was an Army pilot, so you can imagine the ribbing that goes on there.
Sure.
How the other thing I've noticed with Marines is it's probably the branch most likely to make their mother cry when they sign up or their parents frustrated. So how did your parents take it, since they didn't have the military background?
My mom was amazing. She was hyper supportive. She was the type of mom who said something to the effect of, somebody's going to do it, it might as well be you. And that was anything I ever wanted.
That's cool.
Any idea or dream or fantasy or goal that I set, her answer was, somebody's going to do that, it might as well be you. I could have walked in and said, I want to be president, and she would have said, somebody's going to be the president, it might as well be you. I walked in, I remember saying things, you know, I was 14, I said, I want to buy a Corvette. She's like, somebody's going to buy a Corvette, you might as well be that kid.
So that was the phrase she used.
That was her phrase, was somebody's going to do it, it might as well be you. And that was how she was with everything. I don't think she really cared where my life goals took me. She never tried to influence me into anything. She always was very responsive to the things that I showed interest in. And the biggest challenge for me wasn't finding interest. The challenge for me was correlating could this be accomplished? Because I was setting these crazy lofty goals that at least at that age seemed unattainable. And her approach was, go do it. Why wouldn't you? And so when I said, I want to be a Marine, her friend, and I was, Ryan, I'm like 16 saying I want to be a Marine. Her answer was, I know, I could tell you want to be a Marine from all the stuff in your room. But the other answer was, go be a Marine. And so I had her backing and support. I probably could have walked in there and said anything. Fortunately, it was this, but she was completely on board and loved helping me pursue that. She was super supportive of that.
Yeah, that is powerful. That is rare, I feel like, from the people I've talked to. Did you end up talking to Aaron, this guy who kind of planted the seed after you got in?
He still, I still have maintained a connection with him.
No way.
Oh yeah,
that's
absolutely.
Really, that's special.
I mean, random thing is I end up years later, I'm at officer candidate school trying to go through OCS to be in the Marines. And this is years, after college and everything. He ended up getting stationed at Quantico at HMX-1 as a crew chief at HMX-1. And so all through OCS, he was there. So he played a central role in my life, not just influencing me to get into the Marine Corps, helping me understand the path of what it was like to be an officer, how to be a good officer. And when I'm going through officer candidate training, he happened to be on Quantico where the training was. So I was lucky enough that this guy came into my life at the right time and stayed connected. Very influential. Great experience with that guy.
That's awesome. So did you not go straight into like an ROTC program? Did you enlist? How do you do this?
I didn't. No, I didn't enlist, but I do have a little bit of a crazy background since we're sharing stories. And you probably know from my resume, I spent a lot of time with the Navy. I did 4 years off carriers. I was a Top Gun instructor. I did a full exchange with the Air Force, almost 4 years in an Air Force squadron as a Marine. Ton of flying with the Air Force. Even my squadron command in the Marine Corps was on Eglin in a joint exchange. Cool. A joint base with the Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps. But the connection I have,
it was OCS, kind of like your path.
I was going to say, going back was when you asked about that, the connection was I wanted to be a pilot, so I was committed to apply to an Air Force ROTC scholarship, and it was in my junior year of high school. And what's crazy about that is I was just finishing telling you the stories about I knew I wanted to be a Marine. It got in my blood. I really wanted to do this. But at the time, as I'm piecing these things together, as I correlated jets at that time, jets was the Air Force. I wanted to be a fighter pilot. And so I'm working these two things in my brain at the same time. One is I want to be a pilot, and one is I really wanted to be a Marine, but I really focus on the flying thing. So in my junior year of high school, I start going through all the application process. By early senior year in high school, I get selected for an Air Force ROTC scholarship. I got into Embry-Riddle University. I named my major was like aerospace engineering, and I'm doing all these things. And there, in the whole time, in the back of my mind, there's this nagging little thing that just didn't sit right with me. And I had to have that moment. And this is where I think my mom's reinforcement was so powerful, was after I got selected for all this stuff, I'm just about finishing high school. I'm just about to get ready to go to my summer before college. And I go into a room and I go, I don't want to be in the Air Force. I want to be a Marine. She's like, I know, you need to go do that. So I call this guy. This is after I did a campus visit at Embry-Riddle. Like, I'm down the path. And so as I came to this conclusion that it really was more important to be a Marine than a pilot, I walk away from the scholarship. The Air Force guy that helps you with this is like basically telling me I'm crazy because I'm getting a free education. I'm going to get to, assuming I pass everything, I'm going to get at least a chance to go to flight school. And so by the time I show up in the Marine Corps doorstep, they welcome me in, but they're like, there's no ROTC scholarships for you. There's no Navy ROTC Marine option for you. There's nothing available to me.
It's too late.
It's too late. And so like, but Standard Marine Corps, like, we'll find a place for you. And they signed me up. It's my freshman year. I'm still 17 years old when I'm doing this paperwork, is a ground OCS contract. And I'm like, that sounds good to me. I got to be a Marine. And of course, not to be too critical, but they're like, we'll figure out a way to get you the flying spot later. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but the only option available was go to the officer candidate school program for the Marine Corps as a ground officer in the Marines. And then we'll figure out the rest later. And at that age, I was totally good with that. It ended up being an incredibly difficult path to be successful. It did work out, but at the time I was like, I want to be a Marine. And I was so singularly focused on that. I walked away from that Air Force ROTC scholarship. And a pretty decent chance, at least to have the opportunity to fly for the Air Force. No guarantees, but at least a good opportunity. So now I'm going into the Marine Corps as a ground officer to be, who knows, but something on the ground.
Jeez. Did you spend considerable time in that billet as a ground guy?
No, so I did not. So I did all of officer candidate school. You have to go twice. It's a total of 84 days. You break it up into 2 summers during your college years. I have to get my degree. So I finished my degree at the local school. I'm working at Target, working with this guy, telling this guy, Aaron. I graduate, I get my commission, and I go to what the Marine Corps is called the basic school, which you may be familiar with. Yep. All Marine officers go, pilots and ground guys, lawyers, everybody goes. I go to the basic school as a ground officer. So I don't know what job it's going to be, but it's going to be one of the dozen, a couple of dozen ground billets. But I also have been told this whole time that at the basic school, they will give out a couple of pilot slots if you earn them. You got to pass the physical. There's a bunch of stuff you got to do. You got to take, I think they called it the AQTFAR, some aviation test you got to take to be qualified. But all the time, the guys are like, oh yeah, you'll just go there and just grab a slot. And I remember, certainly to this day, I showed up at the basic school, graduated, finished OCS, have my ground contract. And then the first day, there's 250 lieutenants, and they tell you how many of each job they're going to have. They're going to be 22 infantry officers, 18 artillery officers, whatever it might be. And they get down to pilot, and like, 2 of you are going to be pilots. And I'm doing the math like, 2? There's 250 people in here. And so I then came to realize, like, this path is going to be super narrow. Now, it's not 2 out of 250. Several people have contracts. Obviously, not everybody wants to be a pilot. And so that number, I wasn't necessarily competing with 250 people, but I'm competing with a lot of people for 2 spots. And so the story of, oh, we'll just convert you over to flying down the road wasn't nearly as simple as I thought. It really didn't hit me. The anxiety didn't hit me till I got there, and they announced 2 of you will get selected for pilot slots. And it's like, okay, this is no joke. I have to do really well at the basic school. My very first real, experience in the Marine Corps past OCS is what assignment they're going to give me, what MOS, what job. And I wanted to be a pilot. I remember walking away from that ROTC scholarship. Was this all worth it? I had a pretty narrow road to thread there to get that done.
Man, so obviously you get it. I bet it wasn't.
I got the second one. My roommate, guy named Dave Anderson, if he's listening, got the #1 aviation billet. I got the #2 aviation billet. Super crazy. And
did you guys room together because you were both aviation
super random
aficionados?
It's done alphabetical. So we're in first platoon. It's all the A's and the B's. He's Anderson, I'm Berke, and we happen to be roommates at the basic school. And he was a ground guy, wanted to be a pilot. I was a ground guy, wanted to be a pilot. Our other 3 roommates were all aviation contract guys. So we just got very, very lucky. And it turns out, he did a little better than me. I think by the time, they rank you 1 to 250 and it's based on your rank. He was honestly, at the time we got these billets, he was ranked like 5th out of 250. And I think I was like 8 out of 250.
Wow.
And both got our pilot slots, and both we went to flight school together, got wing together. So
that's really cool
there too. We had the same goals that I had.
Dang. So what year are we talking when you go through this?
I show up to basic school in October of 94, and I graduate in April of 95. And April of 95, a couple weeks before graduation, is when I get the nod, hey, you're going to get to go to flight school. And you are now converted from a ground officer to an aviation officer.
Got it. Okay. So
flight school in earnest begins, and off I go to learn how to fly.
So we haven't had a Marine aviator in this sense. So the Army's got a weird way of doing aviation with commission and warrants and that whole process.
Yeah.
Obviously, all the branches have their own. Can you just kind of pick apart, how does the Marine Corps do it? What does that path look like for an aviator?
Yeah, if you've had a naval aviator, I obviously know you have Intake and some others. The Navy guys, it's almost identical. So the Navy and the Marine Corps train together all through flight training. The only difference is when we show up to day 1 of, everybody starts at NAS Pensacola. They call it the cradle of naval aviation. All naval aviators start there, no matter what you fly. When we show up as Marines day 1, the only difference between us and the Navy folks that are going through is we have finished 6 months of the basic school. All Marine officers, no matter where they go, what they do, have this 6 months of immersive training where they basically expose you to every potential job and experience in the Marine Corps. So you get the sense of all those things the Marine Corps is like. Everything from calling for fire to artillery to infantry, defensive and offensive tactics, shooting your rifle, radio, intelligence, exposure to legal, all these different things, supply, all that stuff. And then from there, you get a job. My job was to go learn to fly airplanes. I go straight to Pensacola, and I show up when all the Navy people show up, either from the academy or from ROTC or OCS, and they're coming basically straight from school. So the only difference is you got 6 months of experience on them, very minimal, not a big difference. And then when we start flight training, Marine Corps does a couple of unique Marine things, but 95% of it is exactly the same. Your classmates, Navy Marines, are combined. Your scores, your rankings, all that sort of stuff. It's all one big thing. Now, Marines have Marine billets, Navy have Navy billets, different squadrons, different planes, things like that. But for as the training is concerned, it's exactly the same.
And you're still fighting for kind of fixed wing versus rotary wing, then jets versus cargo, all of that.
The pyramid keeps getting a little more narrow. So I'm clearly willing to take the hardest, most unlikely path, join the Marine Corps as a ground guy, compete for the air slot. It worked out. Then when you get to Pensacola, all pilots of whatever variety start at Pensacola. They go through this indoctrination, academics, you learn how flight rules and things like that, and how engines and aerodynamics and weather, all basic aviation stuff. Then you start in your first aircraft, which at the time was a plane called the T-34. It's long gone. You fly the T-34 for probably 6 or 7 months. And at the end of that, they select you for the Marine Corps. You're going to fly, at the time, they called it jets, props, or helos. You're either going to go to the jet pipeline, the prop pipeline, which was just C-130s, just cargo, or helicopters. And it's a rough number. About 25% end up in jets and 75 end up in props or helos of some variety. And so, yeah, you're competing and the pyramid gets a little bit more narrow. So 25 to 30% of us were lucky enough to make that jet cut, got the grades that we needed and asked to fly jets, and were selected to go fly jets. And then you leave Pensacola and go to more advanced specialized jet training, which is what I got to do.
And when you actually get to a unit, just looking at the career path, everybody, all aviators are officers, right? In the Marine Corps.
That is true in the Marine Corps. We do not have that uniqueness, and I'm enough familiar, not nearly as much as you, obviously, but that warrant officer niche that allows them. We do not have that in the Marine Corps. If you are flying airplanes, you're an active duty Marine Corps officer who has completed officer candidate school or some version of that, the academy, what have you, commissioned and completed TBS, and then gone through the full flight school program and been assigned a platform.
Got it. So for you, and this is just jumping ahead a little bit to make sure we all understand
and don't let me bore you with the details. Tell me if it,
No, man, that's why I'm asking. This is why I'm asking. So I know you end up commanding, right? But not theoretically, not everybody gets to command at different levels.
No,
so I have to imagine you've got people who are flying for their entire career, but might not move into command slots. Who tends to gravitate or get selected for command roles in that environment? Because in the Army, it's very different, where if you're a commissioned guy, you're commanding. And if you're a warrant officer, you're flying.
You're flying, right. Yeah, there is, in theory, there's a lot of different pathways to command, but the percentage of folks from the time you, and back then too, things are a little bit different. Back then, I recall distinctly, if you finished, you got into jets, you go through the jet pipeline, you go through all the jet training, the intermediate and advanced jet training, culminating with the carrier. After you're done with all of jet training and you become a jet pilot, you can, at the time, you're going to get either Hornets, this is for the Marine Corps, F-18 Hornets, the Harrier, or the Prowler. And so even then, you didn't know what platform you'd be. It's much simpler now. I think in the Marine Corps, it's probably like 98% or 95% are going to go fly the F-35. There's a couple of remaining Hornets left, and that's about it. So back then it was, I hate to say, like, nobody wanted to fly Prowlers, and I wanted to fly Hornets. I grew up in El Torro, which was the West Coast Hornet base. I dreamed about flying F-18s. I knew what squadron I wanted to be, and I had all these things in my mind of what I wanted to do. Those are just part of the steps to get to even be considered for command. And you said, you're skipping ahead a little bit, but ultimately your performance in the community, the F-18 community, is what allows you to continue to not just promote, but also get specific jobs in a flying squadron. You have to be the operations officer. You have to be the maintenance officer. You have to have a couple of things that allow you to be considered for command. And then again, it is certainly a numbers game. There is no guarantee you're going to get it, but you elevate within the community. and then you compete against your peers, and it's based on what you did inside of your particular community, your platform, the F-18 community for me. Now, I'm an odd duck. I left the community midway through my career. I didn't command in the F-18 world, but that's essentially how it worked. I commanded because I switched platforms and did some other things, as you alluded to.
Makes total sense. Okay, so where are you at timeline wise when we hit 9/11? What airframe are you flying? Where are you?
Well, I gotta go right before that. Just because you told me to do it, tell the
Please
story.
do.
I went to El Torro High School. I grew up a mile away from Marine Corps Air Station El Torro. All the jets from El Torro in the mid to late 90s, while I'm going through flight school, 95, 96, 97, are all moving down to Miramar. The Navy and Top Gun left Miramar. The F-14s are going away to Oceana. Top Gun's going up to Fallon. And the Marine Corps takes over Miramar. So the Marine Corps is shutting down El Torro and moving to Miramar. I finished flight school. I select to jets and all those things. Anyway, I end up selecting for F-18s West Coast, and I am the last class to fly F-18s in El Toro.
That's super cool.
It's like the coolest thing ever. Not only am I the last class to select to fly F-18s in El Toro, I go back to El Toro. I'm stationed there. Everything's being moved now. There's like nothing left but one little squadron, the F-18 squadron. And I literally flew the last F-18 out of El Toro. I'm in a newspaper called the Saddleback Valley News, which is the local newspaper. We were doing carrier quals. So the last flight out, all the students, in our class, the 5 or 6 of us, fly out to the ship, and you go to the ship by yourself to go do carrier quals. I take off. I'm the last jet to ever launch out of El Toro. I walk out of the hangar. They're like locking the door behind me. The last trucks are driving down to Miramar. In the 4 or 5 days it takes me to carrier qual, the last remaining equipment is going down to Miramar. When I finished carrier quals and I flew off the carrier, I flew into Miramar. So this kid who moved to El Toro when he's 5 has this crazy fantasy. I flew the last F-18 out of El Toro, and they essentially closed the F-18 base behind me behind that. Just a crazy thing. That sends me back down to Miramar. I get into Miramar in 1998. I start my operational fleet flying career in the squadron, this Marine F-18 squadron in Miramar. And I start that in 98. And then I'm in that squadron from 98 till 02. So obviously that takes me through Top Gun student, 9/11, and all those things. I'm in just a regular operational carrier-based fleet squadron at Marine Corps Air Station Miramar.
How, I didn't realize you would do Top Gun that quickly. Is that pretty common to go early in the career, or is it? And try not to be humble. Like, imagine I'm talking to somebody who's speaking on your behalf. Okay.
I appreciate that. It's not unheard of. Nobody's going to look back and be like, Dave Berke was some magical. That's not what happened. But I was very fortunate. I was the most junior of a series of eligible guys that all within a couple of years of me, and some are a little more senior. But ultimately, I was very lucky enough to go through the certification process, all the evaluations, and then every squadron, it's rough, but you typically get 1 billet to Top Gun per year per squadron. Sometimes it's 2 in 1 year and none the next because you're deployed, but it just works out to being 1 per year. And in the first 2 years, you're just working hard. You're just trying to be a good young pilot, learning all this stuff. And in your 3rd year is the first, I would call it window where they're going to consider you. 3rd year of your fleet tour. I was lucky enough to be selected to go to Top Gun as a student. In fact, I go to Top Gun as a student in the summer of 2001. I was in the last graduating class of Top Gun before 9/11. So I went to Top Gun on behalf of my squadron. I was lucky enough to be sent by my squadron to go to Top Gun. I go through the course. I get my Top Gun badge. I come back to my fleet squadron July of 2001. I'm back at Miramar in my squadron thinking about next year's workup cycle for a carrier deployment, and 9/11 hits. And I'm literally the fleet's most recent, newest Top Gun graduate, though, and my other classmates when 9/11 happens. And so a lot of things, as you know, the whole world changed, certainly for us in the military, going from a peacetime military where you're doing Westpacks and deployments are combat in quotes. We're doing Southern Watch and doing a couple of neat things, but ultimately nothing like what was on the horizon. In between my 2 carrier deployments, I go to Top Gun. Then the timeline for deployment accelerates. We move up 4 or 5 months. We go straight to Afghanistan. We start flying combat operations. And I just finished Top Gun a few months earlier. So 9/11 hits. Within a couple weeks or 6 weeks of that, I'm in North Arabian Gulf, flying missions off the carrier, dropping bombs in Afghanistan.
No way. I did not realize it was that quick.
Yeah, really quick.
Quick question. I think Intake mentioned this when I was interviewing him. And again, this is kind of jumping around just a little bit, but he was, he would talk about some of his combat engagements and the experience he had, but he was like, the hardest that it ever was for me was at Top Gun. Now I know there's the instructor side or Blue Angel flying, and it was Wiz who was saying at Top Gun. But from your perspective, either as a student or an instructor there, do you have the same thought process?
It's funny because I know those guys pretty well. So all these stories I'm telling you about El Torro, and I'm learning to fly, the last class I'm learning to fly, Intake is an F-18 instructor at El Toro. So when I'm telling you the stories about me being the last student and literally the last person to fly a jet out of there, Intake's one of my instructors. He's a Navy pilot. And during that time, he wanted to be a Blue Angel. So I knew that he was, and I think he ended up rushing the Blues while we were training F-18s together. He went off to be a demo guy. The guy you're mentioning, Wiz Buckley, when I was an instructor at Top Gun years later, this is 02 to 05, Wiz came through, he went through what's called the adversary course. He was in a Navy squadron and he went through the adversary training program that Top Gun sponsors. I was an instructor. And so Wiz came through the Top Gun adversary course, but he was also a previous instructor at 101 as well. So all that stuff comes full circle. In terms of the dynamic combat preparation, not actual combat, Top Gun is a unique place. I can't speak to demonstration flying in the Blue Angels. Obviously what they do is remarkable, but I don't have insight into what it's like on the inside. But in terms of when we put the students through, I certainly remember being a student and then as an instructor, what the students go through at the weapons school is a very uniquely demanding, special experience by design. Specifically, post 9/11, when I was there, was designed to help them get ready for war. It had been over a decade since we'd been at war, and we needed to get our community prepared to go to combat. And the courses that we created there at Top Gun, especially that I'm familiar with, were hard.
That's super interesting.
Just a quick word from our sponsor, and we'll get right back to this combat story. As you know, I live in California, where we can have earthquakes and fires, and I grew up in Florida with hurricanes. I know firsthand how natural disasters can quickly and unexpectedly put me and my family in a position where we have to hunker down, shelter in place, and sometimes without power, so I always want to have food available. You can create your own stockpile of the best-selling 4 Patriots Survival Food Kits. It's not ordinary food. We're talking good for 25 years super survival food. Handpicked right in a family-owned facility in the U.S., giving jobs to over 200 Americans, which we love. The kits are compact, sturdy, water-resistant, and stack easily. They have different delicious breakfasts, lunches, and dinners, and you can make these meals in less than 20 minutes. Just add boiling water, simmer, and serve. And right now, you can go to 4patriots.com and use the code COMBAT to get 10% off your first purchase on anything in the store, including their 3-month survival kit. You'll get their famous guarantee for an entire year after your order, plus free shipping on orders over $97. They're called 4 Patriots because a portion of every sale is donated to charities who support our veterans and their families. Just go to 4patriots.com and use COMBAT to get 10% off. That's the number 4patriots.com. Use the code COMBAT and start building your own stockpile today. And now, back to this combat story.
Okay, so you're in Afghanistan early. You said 6 weeks, I think. Is that right? Kind of after.
Yeah, I'm trying to do the math. I bet you within 6 weeks of 9/11, we get underway. It's it's pretty close. And listen, man, I'm only doing this because you told me is to tell those stories.
Please do.
But I'm piecing together these things, these things that just revealed themselves in my life. These lucky, fortunate timing things. I told you I watched this movie Top Gun. I'm seeing this guy land a plane on a boat. He goes to war. He has this combat experience, and then they're like, "Hey, come back to Top Gun." So I ended up being a Marine Corps fighter pilot at this base that I grew up in. Go down to Miramar. I ended up in a carrier squadron. The Marine Corps had 4 squadrons, and all of the Marine Corps that flew off carriers. I'm in one of them, one of the 4. We go to war as I'm flying missions in Afghanistan, because I'm the most recent Top Gun graduate. I just finished the course, and the senior instructors at Top Gun reach out to me, and they're like, "Hey, we want you to come back to be an instructor when this deployment's over." So I'm like living this dream. This movie is like happening to me. And so as I'm flying combat in Afghanistan, and we're there for 7 months of combat deployment. We didn't get back till April of 2002. I knew for most of that deployment, when I came home that summer, that late summer, I was going up to Top Gun. So it was a pretty neat experience for me to have this combat tour in Afghanistan, knowing that when that was over, and listen, at the time, I thought that was the war. I didn't know what the future was. That was the war.
Yeah.
I got to go to Top Gun after that, and I knew that I was going to go be an instructor for most of that deployment, which was really special for me to be out there knowing I had this incredible responsibility and obligation waiting for me after this combat deployment, which again was the first real war experience we'd had in well over a decade. You know, I dropped like a JDAM in Southern Watch on my first deployment. There were things going on, but nothing, obviously nothing like this. And, you know, the whole world changed after that. And so I got to be right at the forefront of that, which was pretty wild. And then go back to the schoolhouse to be an instructor there at Top Gun as a Marine was a really special, unique thing.
Jeez, I'm just thinking back to this. Like if you had gone that other route, Air Force, Embry-Riddle, you're never back in El Toro flying that flight. You're obviously not going to Top Gun in this same way. Like
nope, none of these things are happening.
That's remarkable.
I'm not on this podcast. I can tell you that for sure.
That's crazy. Okay. Yeah. So when you're in Afghanistan, that first time you're flying, had people been, presumably, were you getting kind of insights from other pilots who had already been dropping bombs in Afghanistan and prepping you for what you're getting into?
Things had just gotten underway. We weren't at the very forefront of it. You know, we were a few weeks behind the original carriers that were there, but we had this amazing cross-deck experience where all the guys that had been there right when we showed up are helping us. And so we get to jump into it pretty quickly. Everybody's dropping bombs. You know, listen, man, in retrospect, it was a much bigger deal at the time than it is now looking back. Other experiences have surpassed that. And you get more perspective the farther away you are from it. But at the time, it was crazy. We're launching off. We were the night carrier. We had two carriers in the Gulf, in the North Arabian Gulf, daytime and nighttime. You know, it's like 8 a.m. to 8 at night. We're the 8 at night to 8 a.m. carrier. So I look at my logbook. I go like 70 something days without seeing the sun. Everything's a night trap. We're flying 6 or 7 hour missions up the driveway into Afghanistan, tanking big wing tankers, dropping bombs, doing crazy stuff, and getting a ton of insight from other guys. And then when new carriers showed up, we'd help them. And so it was a pretty remarkable experience. Operation Anaconda, which at the time was this massive thing. Oh, yeah. We're getting to be part of all that. So you really could not help but feel that you were right immersed in the mix of the most significant thing, certainly in a generation, also on the heels of September 11th, where we felt like what we were doing was this morally obligated, necessary thing that had real power behind it. And it was an amazing experience and something I feel very, very thankful to have been a part of.
I almost feel like the Top Gun anthem is just playing on that ship 24 hours a day for that first rotation, the way you're describing this.
Believe me, I'm getting grief because, you know, word got out that, Chip's going back to Top Gun to be an instructor. And like, I'm taking heavies from the team and people giving me a hard time.
That's cool. That's really cool. I know from talking to Wiz and intake, I didn't realize how tough it was to land on a carrier. I mean, I can assume, and I'd heard, but like you're doing the night flights for 7 months.
Dude, it was brutal, man. And I got to be honest with you, you know, and I'll certainly mention this down the road and we can talk some other time about it too. And night traps for me were no joke. Day traps were something that normalized. The first time you go to the carrier, it is an overwhelming experience. And I am an absolute fan, an advocate, a believer and supporter of all the branches, all types of aviation. My life was saved routinely by rotary wings, by different service aircraft. I am not an advocate of one over the other. I respect them incredibly. Naval aviation, the ship is unique. There is nothing like it. It is a differentiator in aviation, and it is uncomparable to anything else. And I struggled with that at night. Normalized daytime operations, day VFR at the ship becomes, I hate to say it, it becomes as close to routine as it can, given the fact that you're landing a plane on a boat, which is just crazy. Night ops sucked forever for me. They were always just terrifying. And especially on the heels of launching off 6 or 7 hours, you're by yourself in a jet, you know, you're coming home at 4 a.m, and Then you got to land on the plane on the boat. And oftentimes the carrier landing at night was the hardest thing you were doing, even when you were dropping sometimes. So, and again, my combat experience is never going to go into some book. I wasn't some hero. I just had an experience, much like many others. But I will tell you, the carrier at night is no joke. There is nothing like it anywhere. And I've experienced a lot of aviation, at least on the fixed wing side, and I never got used to it. It was a challenge every single time for me.
That is such a consistent theme that I never anticipated.
Yeah.
Clearly, I think anybody can look at it and say that's hard, and at night it's got to be even harder. But all of the guys I've interviewed have said like they never got used to it. What you just said, kind of like you might have a good landing here or there, but every time it's like holding on to
Dude,
the edge.
it's terrifying. It's just terrifying. And the margin for error is so small. And to the Navy's credit, the Navy makes this thing look so routine. You're doing it. The Navy's doing it hundreds of times a day, every single day for decades and decades and decades. And if there is a tragic event or a mishap, it's a once rare event, and it gets massive, obviously, publicity when it happens, but it hardly ever happens. They make it look so routine. And unlike everything else in aviation, it is the most unique thing you will ever do. There's just nothing like it. And if you're just a little bit off, a little bit wrong, and if the team isn't working together, it is catastrophic. It's catastrophic. And that always stayed with me. And even now, like the anxiety of that feeling, it's been 20 years since I landed on a boat. Night carrier landings will stay with me forever. There's nothing like it. And any carrier aviator would tell you that. And I don't care what else you've done in an airplane. That is a unique thing. And I never normalized that experience in my mind. And it sucked every time.
It's so funny. And I am going to move on from this in a second. So if people just bear with me, but
I'm
I
here
remember,
for you, man. All good.
No, something that Intake mentioned that really stuck with me was when he finished his tour with the Blue Angels, how he kind of just like broke down because he had survived it, you know, like literally like, I did this for 3 years and I didn't die. And, you know, he's got all the stories to tell about how close it was. And he kind of had a similar vein with carrier landings where you're just happy to get out of it. It's probably, there's probably not like an A+ landing. It's just, you didn't get an F on this one.
What's great about the Navy and naval aviation is the best landing. Every landing gets graded. Every single landing at the ship, you get a grade. A guy comes back called an LSO. I was an LSO. I got to live that whole experience. And they come back and like, all right, Ryan, here's your pass. You're a little high here, a little low there. There's a whole vernacular and a nomenclature. And then at the end of the explanation of where you were, you get a grade. And the best grade is called okay. That's the best you'll do, is it was okay. That's the highest grade the Navy gives you for your carrier landings. So you can see that the Navy, for good reason, I consider myself, you know, as a Marine naval aviator, we're on the same boat there, no pun intended.
Yeah.
I understand why that is. There is no good. There is certainly no great. And there's definitely no perfect. The best you're going to do is okay.
Yeah. Same. So schoolhouse at the agency, it's the same thing. The highest you can get is a SAT and you're graded on everything satisfactory. So
I like that approach.
I just before we move on from the Afghanistan time, this first rotation, first of all, I'm envious, like to have been there right after 9/11, doing what you were doing. And just to mention Anaconda, like I studied that. I was in the 101st. I flew with guys who were Apache pilots during that fight. Yeah. So I have tremendous respect. But I got to imagine you were checking in with all kinds of units with JSOC out in the front, like the people on the ground at the beginning. Like, do any of those moments come back to you? Like any memorable moments from that first deployment that you really think back on?
Yeah, I think what was unique about that is how little we really understood what was happening. We have this real sense now, especially looking back, detailed coordination, really understanding the ground scheme of maneuver, fully understanding the nuances and intricacies of how you as an aircraft, as a supporting asset, we're there to help integrate with the maneuvering elements. And how little we truly understood, and you probably know this very well in your second half of your career, how little we understood what was really going on. And I think I bet you I get them wrong, but for some reason, Jaguar 1-4 is a recollection of a prolific a call sign of a ground FAC, and checking in and being asked to do things and thinking you knew what was going on, and then realizing in retrospect, I mean, they were working with the Northern Alliance and all this political input, and we really didn't truly know. We didn't know. We had not supported ground maneuvers since Desert Storm. I was like a sophomore in college when that happened. I didn't know what I was talking about. And so it came that after OEF ended for me, is we would have visitors come to Top Gun, and they'd introduce themselves like, oh, I was here in Afghanistan. I'm like, oh, and we'd be looking at logbooks and recognizing like, we're recording, and they'd say things like, oh, we came in on horseback. And you're like, horseback, and all
awesome.
this stuff has come out now. And again, I want to be really clear, like there's nothing very unique about my experience there. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of folks, so I don't want to sound like an outlier. I just have this sense more retrospectively is it was what they were doing was miraculous, and we truly didn't understand it. We were great support for them. They would tell us what was going on. We try to help them. But what the guys on the ground were doing so quickly after 9/11, to be doing what they were doing in a place so far away and so remote and so dynamic, that in some sense, I always often wonder how we even were able to help them. So that's my retroactive memory of that combat deployment and that experience, what that was like. And there's plenty of autonomous operations where you're just given kill boxes and some autonomy, or someone would tell you to go somewhere was pretty easy. But when we work with the guys on the ground and got checked in and asked them what was happening, to realize just what was going on, and you probably have some really cool insight to that, man, it's remarkable what they were able to accomplish during that time, that soon after September 11th.
Yeah, I've been when I got to the agency, we'd go and do we'd have meetings and joint work with our foreign allies, and we'd be sitting at the table like having dinner or drinks afterwards, and people from other countries would be like, "Oh, I was on this mountain range, in this month," and then one of like there'll be a GB guy who's like, "Really? You were over there?" So like, just not even, certainly the JTACs had to know where everyone was, but there were so many people crawling around on the ground there that we're still not going to know for several years for sure.
Crazy times,
Jeez.
Really crazy times. A great time in my career, young, single, motivated. I would have stayed out there forever. I was on the ship. I was really doing what I always wanted to do. I look back on that as one of the most fond, best memories of my entire life.
I don't doubt it. And when you go back to Top Gun, I know you got the Echelon Front logo behind you, and we'll touch on this. Like you're teaching now, and you can please caveat so I don't miscommunicate this, but I have to imagine like teaching at Top Gun has got to be kind of tip of the spear, like applying lessons that you're just learning from the battlefield and delivering them to students. It's probably got similar work to Echelon Front.
Without a doubt. I, as a leadership instructor at Echelon Front, and I know we'll get to that because I know we'll talk about me going back to Iraq on the ground. We'll talk about working with the SEALs, Leif and Jocko. There's no way we can get around that. It's just such an important part of the story that brought me back to Echelon Front. I leverage what I learned about teaching at Top Gun probably more than anything else. And the attributes and the challenges to be able to be good at teaching and be able to good at communicating, and to be able to take all this collective understanding and the responsibility that we had and impart that on people that are going to go off to war. I leverage that not just at Echelon Front, but in so many aspects of my life. One of the most seminal and maturing experiences I ever had was being an instructor at Top Gun, because I did those 4 years in my fleet squadron. I went to Top Gun as an instructor. And by the time I left Top Gun, as in the Navy, they call it the training officer. I was a senior pilot at Top Gun, the senior instructor as a Marine. And so I had this massive outside sense of obligation and responsibility, that everything we were doing there was training this generation of pilots, this first generation of wartime pilots. And the staff had to set a bar, an incredibly high bar, because of the obligation we had to train the students. And so I felt I was there during a massive transition for Top Gun, because we went from a peacetime world to a wartime world. And no judgment, but the previous war was like a week long. It wasn't this long sustained year after year after year thing. So it had been an entire era, an entire generation of not real combat, not real sustained combat. And all of a sudden we switched to war is there was no end in sight. We weren't looking at the end of war during my entire time there. It was just almost in perpetuity. And so as I'm there as the Top Gun instructor, and then as the senior instructor at Top Gun as a Marine, what I felt more than anything was an obligation to be as good as I possibly could be, because I had to teach other people. And that has stayed with me forever. And that stays with me at Echelon Front for sure.
And they got to be the first ones going downrange when they get back to their units, right? Just like you were a fresh Top Gun graduate, like
the term patch wearers, obviously it's a little bit of cliche, but those that have graduated from the weapons school have an obligation to be the leaders in their squadrons. And so absolutely, when things go wrong and when things are challenging, they turn to those weapons school graduates. Same is true for the Air Force, same is true for the Marine Corps. So we're not unique in that sense, but definitely in naval aviation, fighter aviation, Top Gun graduates are the ones that they look to as, okay, what do we do? And their leadership is critical in being the ones to take those teams and those groups and those flights and those elements out into war when people aren't sure what to do. That's who they turn to. So we felt that responsibility.
If this is probably a tough question to answer, but when you're at Top Gun and you said you kind of like really learned how to teach there,
Yeah.
Are there one or two things that as you look at that, if you hadn't gone through the gauntlet that is a Top Gun instructor, you know, probably the hardest instructing you have to do,
it is,
that you probably wouldn't have been able to learn somewhere else, that you look back on like, well, I had those 4 years and there are a couple things that make you a really good instructor?
I think there's two things that I take away from my experience at Top Gun that stayed with me that I now look back on and go, thank God I learned that. Thank God I was given that incredible opportunity to teach at Top Gun. One is the precision with which you can operate. It isn't really truly revealed until you get there as an instructor and go through the instructor syllabus. So every level of your experience, you learn to fly an airplane, you think I've got this flying thing figured out. Then you get to go to fly a jet and like, oh, I think I've got this thing figured out. And at every level you feel like I've achieved what I'm going to be able to achieve. And I went through as a student and I'm like, okay, I graduated from Top Gun as a student. I got asked to be back an instructor. I kind of get this whole thing, right? And when then you get there and you get exposed to what the process of becoming an instructor is like, and you see the precision with which they are expected to operate. When we're critiquing ourselves, literally, Ryan, down to the syllables that we're using, are we adding additional syllables? Am I saying, tracking instead of track, and wasting 1/8 of a second of radio time with an inefficient call? Holy cow, there's a whole level of capability I didn't think I was able to achieve that you realize you can do. So you can get really, really good. But what that's more closely connected to, I think is very important, is the humility you learn there. Because what's unique about getting the fortunate opportunity to continue to elevate inside an organization to a place like that is you don't become more arrogant. You don't become more cocky. You become more humble because you start to see other people doing things that you didn't know that could be done. And you start to feel like, man, I'm going to have a hard time achieving that. And what Top Gun has this incredible capability of doing is getting you to be as good as you can be and teaching you to be as humble at the same time. And often people think those are two different things. The reality is I've discovered is they're not, they're the same, because the humility comes from seeing things that you didn't even know existed and a capability that you didn't think could be achieved, and realizing, wow, I got there. The senior guys were so much better than I realized, could do so much more. And then to go, hey, I have to get to that level. I have to be that good. I have to learn so much more. It's an incredible way to teach humility and skill at the same time, which I have not seen replicated in very many places. And I think is the thing I took away the most that I've applied to my life, is the balance of humility and competence. You have to be really good, but you have to be really humble. And one infects the other.
That is definitely one of the things I've heard from some of the other pilots who have talked about Top Gun, just the misconception that people come out of there super cocky. And even for myself, I've always wondered, like, is it the military that makes you a bit more humble just in general? Because you see people who can lose their life doing the basics of the job, or if it's aviation, because there's such a small margin for error, even if you're training, like just a basic flight kills people.
Yeah. And you're right there. Aviation is unique in that, is that all the training we do is high risk. There's no low risk flights.
No.
It's a flight. I shared this with you, and I think you said it really well. And I think it's important for me to reinforce this. The military and aviation, certainly, but the military, I think, teaches that too. I you asked me to come on the podcast. So I look at your guest list and I'm like, why would you even bring me on your podcast? I think what's crazy about the military, what's beautiful about it is you look at the people around you and you think there's so many amazing people doing so many amazing things. It's almost, I would say it's not impossible, but it's very close to impossible to look at the people you've had and think anything arrogant about yourself. There's a humility that comes from just being surrounded by other people that do these remarkable things that can't help but make you humble. And so oftentimes the longer you're in the military, especially a wartime military, and the more you see other people doing remarkable things, it almost mandates the humility. Now, not everybody embraces that. Some people resist that, which is unfortunate, and that's human nature. But even your guest list, I'm like, good Lord, what am I going to even talk about on this guy's podcast? And the experience those people have and share, because that's endemic in the military, that breeds a sense of humility that is in some ways hard not to embrace. And so it's a wonderful thing to be surrounded by people doing amazing things, because that humbles you and go, well, that's a pretty crazy thing that person did. I don't think I could do that. That's a humbling thing. And it's a powerful thing. And I'm really glad you have a platform to allow that. But for me, it's a little intimidating. Like, if I'm listening to this guy and that guy, I'm going to want to listen to that guy because what he did looks pretty remarkable. And I think the military does that well, is sharing that. And it humbles all of us to see our peers doing that, which is really cool.
I bet that, whether you want to call it imposter syndrome, what have you, but even at Echelon Front, you've got Jocko, you got all these like heavy hitters, no doubt.
Yeah, so, man. But I am surrounded by people that, by their existence alone, my ego gets checked pretty regularly. I don't have to worry too much about how much better I am than anybody else at Echelon Front. That's for sure.
Oh yeah, that's great. Okay, so I'm trying to do the math on the timing here. Like you're post 9/11, you're spending 7 months there, then you're at TOPGUN for a couple years, and then you're in Ramadi in 06.
Yeah.
Like, do you go right out of flying into being a ground air controller?
Yeah. So standard. I go to TOPGUN. I'm like, hey, I've done everything I ever dreamed of. I watched this movie when I was a kid. I lived the movie. I'm super, everything happened the way I wanted to. Just this amazing experience. So of course I'm going to get out. There's nothing left to do. I apply to, I think about dropping my letter. I'm going to apply to business school. And as I'm thinking about leaving TOPGUN, in my contract, I had fulfilled my 8 years to the Marine Corps. I'm legal to get out. Talk to the Marine Corps, and they're like, hey, we really would like to have you go back to flying. You have this great experience as a top. I told you, the training officer and the senior guy there, and comes out like, okay, I'm going to stick around for one more tour. And they give me flying orders to go to Japan. And I just gotten married. I'd met my wife while I was at TOPGUN. We're living this fantasy life of, she's dating a Top Gun instructor. We're going skiing in Tahoe. I'm, by the way, driving that Corvette that I was thinking about as a little kid.
Did you have a motorcycle, Dave, or no?
No motorcycle, but I had a vet. So I'm a walking cliche, man. I'm that guy. Me and my wife, we get married, but there's this little, and I'm planning on being done. I had accomplished everything. I got qualified in the F-16. I have two airplanes that I'm flying, unheard of at the time. First Marine to go through the F-16 training at TOPGUN in 15 years. Just, it's all awesome. I've done it all. I'm going to leave. But there's that little thing about the Marine Corps that I felt like, man, I really wanted to be a Marine. I took this path down the Marine Corps, and I felt that something very small was absent. I wanted to leave the military having what I considered an truly authentic Marine Corps experience. And while my experiences were great, I finished the basic school. I went to Navy flight training. My Marine squadron was on a Navy carrier, and I was a Top Gun instructor. It was a very Navy-centric experience, which was great. But I wanted to be a Marine, and I like, you know what? I need to do something unique to the Marine Corps. And so, so I had these orders to go fly. I went to we called it the monitor, the person that gives you orders. And I'm like, hey, listen, I don't want to do this flying tour. I want to be a forward air controller, a ground FAC. And he basically laughed at me. He's like, no, you're a pilot. You're an instructor at Top Gun. You're the senior pilot at Top Gun. You're going to go to a squadron and you're going to teach guys. The Marine Corps had something called the hot fill list. And on the website of these jobs, they would list these jobs that everybody hated and nobody wanted, that they didn't want to force people on. So a little disclaimer on the website that said, if you volunteer for this job, and there was a list there, you will automatically get it, and you can pick your next set of orders. And I'm like, I'm already going to Japan, and on this hot fill list was a billet to be a forward air controller in Japan. And I'm like, okay, being a FAC is a real Marine Corps thing. It's a check in the block. I really wanted to do it. I could also go be a FAC for a year. They'd send me to Miramar. I'd get orders back, and I could finish my career with a cool flying job and back in San Diego, and that'd be the end of it. So I'm like, hey, it says I have this job, and he resisted, and I kind of just show the regulation, like, you have to give me this job. And so begrudgingly, I was able to volunteer for this FAC tour. And the FAC tour was supposed to take me to Japan to set up this unit called ANGLICO, this 5th ANGLICO unit. And it was going to be awesome because I was going to go to school, learn to be a FAC, go to Japan for a year, stand up this unit, go back to Miramar, get in the Hornet. I'm going to apply to business school, and I'm going to move on my way out. I get to Japan. I leave Top Gun in August of 2005. I get to Japan in September. I go through a couple months of FAC training to become a qualified FAC. I get out there in November-ish. And as soon as I'm there, the commander of this ANGLICO unit said, hey, we need a volunteer. We need a volunteer of I don't know, 50 guys or a brigade platoon to go to Lejeune, because that active duty ANGLICO, 2nd ANGLICO, just come back from deployment in Iraq. They're on a very quick 7-month turnaround, and they're shorthanded. They need to go right back to Iraq because the war is really, it's 2005. The war is really, things are bad. Things are heating up. Things are not going well. And I knew that I couldn't not volunteer. It would have been an awful thing to go on this FAC tour and try to dodge that bad deal. So I'm like, hey, I'll volunteer. I'll go to Camp Lejeune. Cool. So my wife, who we just got married in this year in Japan of scuba diving and visiting Tokyo, I'm like, this isn't going to happen the way we planned. The good news is we're going to go back to the States. You get to live in San Diego because I already have orders going back there. Everything's cool. I have to go to Camp Lejeune, and I got to deploy to Iraq. I get to Camp Lejeune in January. The deployment is going to be in February. Because I'm a relatively senior guy, am the senior FAC at 2nd ANGLICO, the most senior by rank. And so the squadron, or the unit commander, the ANGLICO commander, comes to me and says, as the senior FAC, here's all the FAC teams, and here's all the locations. Fill out this roster of who's going where in Iraq. And it just so happened that my best friend was currently a FAC in Ramadi. This is early 2006. And I'm talking to him regularly. And Ramadi is the center of the war. Everything is in Ramadi. It was Fallujah the year before. It was Baghdad the year before that. But now it's 05, 06. And Ramadi is where everything is. And so, of course, as much as I didn't want to, I felt this sense of obligation of, that's where I have to go. So I literally remember, I have the pen, I have the paper. I take my team and put it first in Ramadi, and then I have all the other people go. And so I go from Top Gun in August of 2005, and by January of 2006, I'm on my way to Ramadi.
Jeez. So real quick,
I wanted to be a Marine.
I love it. I love that.
Crazy.
What is the difference between an ANGLICO and a FAC? So for people listening.
Yeah, very simply, all Marine battalions have what's called a FAC, a forward air controller. And it's a Marine battalion is 700 or 800 Marines, just a regular infantry maneuver element. Different units have them, not just infantry battalions, but a FAC is the organic Marine that is there to coordinate what's called the MAGTF. Marine Corps operates organically, like to operate by themselves. So they have air forces, land forces, and logistics forces that combine what we call the MAGTF, the Marine Air Ground Task Force. We don't like to rely on other services. So we like to do everything ourselves. So the Marines on the ground want to be able to use the Marines in the air. The FAC, who is a pilot, is the coordinator. Inside a Marine battalion, there is a FAC to coordinate that. ANGLICO has this very unique role that had been around for a long time, but what was unique about Iraq is the Marine Corps owned the battle space. So all the areas in Iraq we were going to go to west of Baghdad was owned by the Marine Corps. So all the airplanes and support were Marine Corps airplanes, but not all, but most of the ground units, due to just what was going on, were Army units. And as you know, the Army and the Marine Corps don't do anything the same. Everything is different. And as a Apache pilot, you know it better than anybody.
Yep.
And so what the Marine Corps understood was they needed somebody called a liaison between ground Army and Marine Air. That person is called an ANGLICO FAC, Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company. It's still a FAC, but he can talk to the Army and go, hey, tell me what you want, and I will liaise with the Marine Corps because you don't understand how they operate, but I do. I will work for the Army, bringing in the airplanes. So rather than being a regular Marine FAC, I essentially worked for the Army, supporting them, helping them use the Marine Corps airplanes, because normally when the Army deploys, they take Army airplanes, helicopters. But in Iraq, that's not how it was. Army on the ground, Marine in the air, they need a liaison. That's what ANGLICO does. And so every FOB, every base, every location, like 26 across all of Iraq, there is an ANGLICO FAC team called Assault, a supporting arms liaison team with 13 Marines, 3 teams basically, and a leader. I was Assault leader to support the Army. So even being a Marine, I end up working for the Army. And when I show up to work for the Army as their air liaison, that's the wrong word. That makes you think of like Air Force ALO. That's not what it is. It's a FAC to liaise for them. A SEAL team shows up.
I was going to say,
SEALs, you got these Marine Anglicos all there to help the Army.
Dang.
And that's how I came to be close friends with Leif and Jocko, and my SALT, especially my firepower team, my 5-man team. And I had 3 teams that I was responsible for running around the battle space. I essentially embedded with Jocko's task unit and specifically Leif's platoon. So the entire 7 months that I'm there, 6 of it is with Leif and Jocko. All the stuff the SEALs did, they're like, they had FACs too, but their FACs wanted to be SEALs. They didn't want to be calling airplanes. So like, and I didn't want to be a SEAL. I wanted to be a FAC. So it was a great relationship that our teams basically combined. It's a strong word, but we were really, really close. So I could relieve them of all the airplane stuff. And I spent 6 months in Ramadi supporting the Army with Jocko's task unit and Leif's platoon. That's how it got to be so close.
Got it. And certainly, it's been a while since I read Jocko's book, but I think he's talking about leadership experience, but he draws on times in Ramadi. So yes, plenty of books on Ramadi, but that one in particular, given your connection, like yes, it shows how insane things were on the ground at different times.
It was a unique time. It was a confluence of things. At the time, I remember Time Magazine did this big thing. It was the most dangerous city in the world. I just happened to be there alongside those SEALs. I never thought, Ryan, at the time I'd come back to, wasn't thinking Echelon Front and private sector.
I know. Yeah.
All I was thinking was, I am in way over my head. I have no business being here. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a pilot. I'm barely functional thinking and I'm in an unbelievably violent urban environment supporting an Army brigade that's taking significant losses. That the 1-1 AD had 485 wounded and 94 killed on that deployment. It was a brutal time being there. 61 killed in the 6 months that I was there. And Jocko's team and my team had this incredible responsibility to try to help them as much as we could. And I was way out of my comfort zone. I'm so thankful for how accommodating the Army was and how strong my relationship was with the SEALs, that I think was a big reason why I made it through that deployment and survived that, given how insanely violent and crazy it was. It was an unbelievable time, the summer of 2006.
I feel like you're being too humble here. I mean, like you understand what's going on in the air better than anyone. Oftentimes you've got JTACs who are trained, and I get it. Like they understand, but like you've been in the cockpit and understand that perspective slightly differently.
Having done combat deployments in the Hornet, a couple of them, helped tremendously my perspective of understanding how to utilize them correctly to give them what they wanted. And I was absolutely put in a unique position, the right place at the right time. Where I was overwhelmed was getting in firefights, shooting my rifle, watching people get wounded and going to memorials and all those things that I know is understandable. And again, I mean this in the most deference. My story pales in comparison to some of the people who've had on here, but I did have that experience where I never anticipated that. And so my sense of feeling that overwhelming, what am I doing here, came from the environment that I was in. I was absolutely in the right job and in a great place to support with those assets. And I was lucky because we had Hornets, Harriers, Hueys, and Cobras. And in my logbook, I got to control every type of ordnance in the Marine Corps inventory. All the guns and the Hellfires off the Hueys and Cobras, LMAV, JDAM, Hellfire, GBU-12, the gun, Type 1 gun runs, things that all I ever saw of was like in books and in schools. But because I was in Ramadi supporting the SEALs and the Army there, we got to do all those things. And I was very well trained for that. But I was very lucky to be shepherded and helped and supported by the people around me so I could survive in the environment that was nothing I ever anticipated.
Jeez. Can you Can you take us through a more challenging op for you when you're on the ground there? And like, take your pick, I guess.
Yeah.
But just from,
and again,
you don't need to caveat.
It's important though, because there are so many remarkable stories. Obviously, the ones for me that are the hardest to want to recall and recollect are the ones where people got killed. I was the controlling FAC. I controlled the Hellfires off that Cobra when Mark was killed. Having to bring my radio operator off a Bradley fighting vehicle, knowing that he'd been killed. Like, I remember those things like I was there, like I was just there yesterday. And so I have those things, but it's a unique experience to recall those things. And I don't want to diminish or marginalize any of those things. There are some missions that I remember thinking, I have this very clear recollection of going on one of my first movement to contacts. And Ramadi is a very urban place. It's like urban, 400,000 people in a city that's 10 or 11 square miles wide. And right outside the city, it might as well be the jungle in Vietnam. Very rural, canals, dirt roads, grass, that kind of thing. And I remember doing my first rural operation after having been there for a couple months, and I meet the platoon commander who I'm supporting. And as I go into his office to meet him, he comes out and he's wearing a shotgun. And I'm like, hey, I literally go, what's with the shotgun? And he goes, I find this is the best weapon for these type of missions. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what the hell what am I getting myself into here where he thinks the shotgun is the right weapon? So I have this ongoing recollection of feeling like I was in way over my head. What was I doing here? And not that it ever got normalized, but we would take contact enough that after a while, I became accustomed to the idea that we were going to get shot at and get into a firefight. And the first couple of movement to contact, which is strictly a mission where you walk around until you get into a fight, just seems insane, especially for a pilot. And then the idea that would normalize and go, this is what we're going to do, having those moments. And then, of course, I have probably one mission where I would say was the bleakest for me personally in terms of what I thought was going to happen to me. But I don't ever want that to diminish the reality that what other people endured and suffered, and having to see that loss. That caveat is just to remind myself, and I know this is, I came home. So yeah, it was all good with me. I was very, very lucky.
I think part of it is, especially as younger people listen to this, that I don't want them to think like Top Gun is what it's really like. I mean, the movie in this case.
That's right.
But it's bleak. It's hard as hell and stuff you can't imagine. And I might even ask you to talk about a memorial service, as tough as it is. Like, I remember going to one of those, and it's heartbreaking, and it's more of like showing that side of that reality to people.
I really like how you said that, man. I've everything you said, I've just enjoyed your perspective on that. And this conversation is a blast. And this is going to sound, again, I don't know how it sounds. All my combat experiences in an airplane, of which there were a few, they were certainly memorable. And I told you at the time that felt like war. If you ask me to talk about combat, I don't even think of flying. I don't even think of it. I can't. And that doesn't mean that my combat flying wasn't amazing. Obviously, it doesn't mean that my experience at Top Gun wasn't unbelievable. But not just in the movies, but even in reality, being a ground FAC in Ramadi in 2006, serving alongside soldiers, Marines, and SEALs in that place at that time gave me a perspective I never expected. And in the 1 year of me being out of the cockpit, that experience outweighs everything I ever did in an airplane tenfold. Not the least of which is because that's the closest I ever got to death. And the memorials and listen, my radio operator was killed. Chris Leon, June 20th, 2006, first Anglo Marine killed in Iraq was my radio operator. My son is named after Matthew Leon Berke is my son, named after Chris. And so it's not just the memorials where you think as a Marine, as a pilot, you feel insulated from that. And all of a sudden you're in the middle of it. I know what that memorial feels like. I know what it's like to write the letter to his mom. I know what it's like to have to talk to his mom. I know what it's like to go back to Arlington and give his mom the flag and all these things that they seem like they're not real experiences, that things you see in the movies. And I know this sounds odd, but I feel so fortunate to have been able to experience that, not just to humble myself, but to have hopefully been some comfort to the people that endured so much more loss than I did, not the least of which is Chris's mom, who I'm still incredibly close with today, but that I was given this opportunity to do something that far transcended all of my childhood fantasies, which centered around planes and movies and air shows. And it was something that I was lucky enough to get to do, that I had this sense of knowing I needed to, but not understanding what it's like, that changed the entire course of my life. And it has nothing to do with being a pilot. Now, obviously they're all connected, but the most important thing and the most influential and seminal thing of my life was the year I was a FAC, and it changed everything. It's all connected for sure. But had I not done that, my life would have been vastly, vastly different, vastly different.
It's funny. One of the guys that we had on, I'm still would say I'm fairly close to him, a guy named Todd Opalski, who's a former Marine, enlisted, then a recon guy, did 4 years at Delta post 9/11, like very accomplished, runs a Zen retreat in Costa Rica now. Like this guy's living the dream as far as I'm concerned. But I was just talking to him again and talking through like of all that stuff he went through, what was the hardest thing he had to go do? And it was notifying the family. Like it wasn't combat and kicking in a door and watching somebody get shot. It was the family notification.
It's such a classic life dichotomy. And I like using that word because we use it all the time. Is I am so grateful for the relationship Kathy Leon has, not just with me, but with my kids, and how close we are to her. And I'd give anything to have her be a stranger in my life. I'd give anything to have there be no need for her to be connected to me because her son came home. I wish that was the case. And so you see these experiences, and I can imagine why he does this retreat, is to try to create as much good as possible from the men and women that didn't come back, to try to validate their sacrifice by making the people who did come home, making their lives better. And you feel that burden and obligation. Kathy is my one. Some people have dozens of those experiences. I had one. And Jocko and Leif have theirs, and you know, there are several, but that burden is a blessing and a curse, and it lives together so closely. And all that came from the fortunate opportunity for me to get outside of not just my comfort zone, but also my fantasies and my dreams, to go do something uniquely Marine that I thought and didn't know getting myself into, that ended up being the most influential life experiences I've ever had, that I'll take with me forever and change the nature of who I am as a person as a result of that. And, you know, I even talk about, you know, near-death experiences. I've had some of those and I think about those, but if I think about Iraq, I think about Chris, and I think about Kat, and I think about my son, and I think about those things that we had to experience and how fortunate and sad they are at the same time.
Would you mind taking us to that one near-death experience for you?
This one's the worst, man, because it's a sense of helplessness that I have never had since. And it was a very influential experience that made me appreciate what good leadership gives us, which is control, what ownership gives us, which is control. And I'm doing this movement to contact. I was telling you about this. We're out in this rural area. I've got my ANGLICO team. We drive in a Humvee. I always kept my turret gunner and my and my driver in the Humvee as a little kind of a base of operations from our push point. And I'd walk on the patrol with me, my corpsman, my medic, and my radio operator. And we'd we usually walk in between two squad or platoon. Squad is about the right size. It's like a squad plus, not quite a platoon, maybe 20 or so folks of two different soldier groups, army groups on either side. And I'd stick myself in the middle. So if either one made contact, I could quickly get to one side or the other. And we'd been doing these for a while. It's the middle of summer. It's hot as hell. And I remember walking on this patrol and getting mortared. I know this sounds almost super arrogant, but like, we got mortared all the time. It wasn't a big deal. And so I hear these mortars go off in the distance, ba-boom, and like, oh yeah. And I'd always had airplanes overhead. I was there to talk to airplanes. And I remember kind of taking down to a knee and go, hey man, you know, we've got these mortars coming in. Just keep an eye on it. It sounds like it came from the west, and very nonchalant, very no big deal, just trying to be casual, you know. And then ba-boom, ba-boom. And I'm like, oh, hey, those, you know, I'm about to say, hey, those things were a little bit closer. And the minute I key the mic to say those things a little bit closer, this hail of gunfire lights up from the two flanks. And so we'd been doing this enough, they probably figured out what was going on. And these aren't AK-47, 7.62. These are heavy caliber, big, heavy machine guns. And they start, I feel it initially from, I would call it my right side. And then shortly after that, I start to feel it from my left side, if you want, and it happened to be east-west, didn't really matter. And I'm like, oh, and I have to start to get down. And what I have to do is get down into I literally have to get so low I'm in the prone position. I'm laying on my face, on my stomach. And what's crazy about that is I can picture it is my doc, my corpsman's like maybe 20 yards in front of me. He's behind this massive tree in this little ditch, this little riverine ditch with this great cover. He's at this totally safe spot. But like 5 feet, 10 feet away from me is my radio operator, who was always right next to me, is looking at me, this kid Mo, and if he hears this, he'll remember this plain as day. And I see Mo's eyes, they're like as big as saucers. And between me and Mo, all these rounds are hitting the dirt and kicking dirt up onto our faces. But as I'm laying there and feeling the volume of the fire, and you can see even in the daytime, the tracers have a little bit of a color to them. As I start to think about moving, my corpsman is waving me over into this ditch. I realize I can't move. I can't lift my head up. I can't move my arms. And your brain moves really fast. It moves, you go through 100 thoughts in a second. They're like millisecond thoughts. It's move my hand, lift my head up. And I'm a pilot. I'm used to thinking very fast and coming up with the right answer pretty quickly. And so I go through this logic train of all the things I want to do. And every time I think about it, I'm like, you can't do that. I can't reach my hair now. I'll get hit. I can't do anything. So I'm totally pinned down there. I can't shoot. I can't do anything. It's awful. It's the worst feeling. And I look at Mo and he's looking at me, and I think we're seeing the same panic on our faces. And then I see the fire start. I feel it shifting towards me. It's like, and you can feel fire move in through the sky. It's a crazy feeling. I know you understand this. And as it shifts towards me, this is all probably maybe 15 seconds. Feels like forever. But in my brain, I run through 10,000 options, and they're all like, no, 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 can't do anything. And I come to the conclusion, like, I can't do anything. And about 3 seconds in, before I think I'm gonna get hit, I'm like, holy shit, I'm gonna die. And I have this clear recollection of all I was thinking about was my wife. And what I was thinking about in my head was, this is crazy to tell the story. I can't believe I'm telling the story. It's like 3 a.m. in San Diego. I volunteered for this FAC tour so we could get back to San Diego. We've got our whole lives ahead of us. We had just gotten married. This is the best thing ever. The last thing she says to me on my deployment, as I'm leaving, she says, don't be brave. She says that she's in tears, don't be brave, which is her way of saying, don't do anything stupid, man. Just come home. Promise me you'll come home. And I'm like, of course I'm coming home. And I'm laying down with my legs apart in the prone position. I literally cross my legs. It's the last thing I do because I don't want to get shot up in between my legs. And I'm like, this is insane. And it was a sense of helplessness that I, for the first time in my life, felt like I had no options. There was nothing I can do, and the outcome was sealed. And I kind of just gave up. It's a terrible way to describe it, but I can't think of any other words. Bullets get 2 feet from me. They go up, over my head, and back down. I'm telling you, man, it's crazy. And my doc, who's screaming, and the bullets are so loud I can't hear him, but he's waving at me. I have this window where I get up, I run, I dive into this ditch. Sure enough, I get into this ditch. As you can imagine, 1 second later, Mo, who's a big, strong, 220-pound stud of a Marine, lands on top of me, practically kills me. So I'm laying on my back. Mo is laying on my stomach. I'm bear hugging him. The bullets are going over the top of us. And the platoon commander says, we have to get out of here. Because we're behind these trees when this I'm protected, but I can't do anything because he wants to start to maneuver on these guys, which is, of course, 100% correct. He's thinking all the right things. There's a little house behind us. And I screamed something like, I'm not going anywhere. And it's, of course, all very humorous in retrospect, but at the time, I'm like, get out of here. I'm not going. And he's thinking, we have to get from the defense to the offense. We got to assault this position. We got to do all these smart things. I have to start talking to airplanes. It turns out this entire time, my microphone on my M-biter is keyed. And so the pilots overhead have recorded this whole thing. I ended up getting, the pilot sent me the video and the audio and everything. And it's all funny after the fact. But in all seriousness in this one, because I've never in my life resigned myself to the outcome before. I've always had this sense of being able to control. And it's a really awful, awful feeling of, I don't know what to do and I can't do anything. And none of my logic train leads me, like, I can't even shoot because I'm going to be shooting past friendlies. I can't put head up. I'm sure there were some smarter things that other people could have come up with that I didn't. But when I had that thought of like, crap, the last thing I thought was, my wife is going to be so mad. She's going to be so mad at me for doing this, for ruining everything. And the fact that I got out of that thing is crazy. We ended up getting that thing. We had to throw a bunch of smoke grenades that move, mask our movement, and everything turned out fine. Even though I hurt my back, like Mo crushed my back, and it would hurt the rest of the deployment. It's nothing like some of the other stories on here, but the feeling of helplessness as a leadership instructor now, the power of taking ownership of a problem that you feel like isn't your fault, you feel like isn't because of you, caused by some external force, happens beyond your control. The beauty of taking ownership is it gives you power and it gives you influence. It gives you control. And I know what it feels like to feel like you don't have control. And I hate it. It's a debilitating, awful feeling that came from that very quick experience. And it stays with me. Of the lesson is, I don't ever want to feel like that again. And the beauty of that is I can teach leadership using that as an example of every ounce of control we can take it. And that means taking responsibility for things you might not want to take responsibility for, because the beauty of that is it gives you what you want, which is control. So even in that crazy experience where I'm like, well, I guess this is it. My wife's going to be mad. This whole thing's going to come to an end for nothing. It's really awful. It was a powerful lesson inside that. And thank God nobody got hurt. Nobody got killed. And we were just blind luck, and the volume, feeling that just a surreal out of body thing. That's my closest experience. I was in gunfights and this and that, and it's like they're all crazy, especially when you're a pilot. You're like, what am I doing here? And the SEALs are all into it and doing cool, fun stuff. And I'm like, this is nuts. That one will stay with me forever.
I don't think I've talked to any. First of all, that was incredibly well said. Like the feeling of helplessness is palatable as you described that, because you really have like, can't go forward, can't go back. Like you have no out anyway. And I had the feeling that goes through your head that you described, thinking about your wife, like my nearest, closest death experience. That moment, I was like thinking of my son. I had a 6-month-old son at the time, and my wife, but mainly my son at that time. But I'm sure it would have been my wife had it been 6 months prior.
Totally.
That's like the thing that goes through your mind of, I'm young, what the hell is going to happen? And I often ask guys about having to resign yourself that you might die doing this job. I almost feel like somewhere along your career, you watch somebody else fly off a carrier into the ocean or crash or get shot. And you just have to think like, if I'm going to be successful, I have to have this mentality where it's okay if I don't make it. Yeah. But what you just described is like another level that I've not heard before. That was interesting.
And what you described, again, I think you said it so well. I think all of us that go into those experiences, and you've had pilots telling these amazing stories about having to deal with all these incredible things. I think all of us accept there's a potential outcome. You deal with it, you move on, and it kind of gets past you. But you feel like even in those situations, like if I'm flying an airplane, I'm going to be in control of that all the way to the end. And so even the recognition that this might not go the way that I want, I'm still going to go down doing the things that I want to be doing. That feeling of laying in the dirt with no options. Wow. That was what was unique for me about, not like I'm in this fight or in an airplane or and something happened to me. It's I'm laying there. I'm like, you got to be kidding me, man. Like, is this how it's going to happen? And then the explanation that my wife was going to get and why I kept coming to her, like you said, I didn't have kids at the time, is we had just gotten married. We got married 5 months before my deployment. So
jeez.
She's 25 years old. She moved to San Diego. And oh, by the way, like the last 2 years, she's dating a Top Gun instructor. Like it's like fantasy land. It's like being at Disneyland every day. It's the funnest thing ever. And now I'm going to ruin her life. I'm going to ruin her life because I volunteered for this job that I felt I had to do. And I'm going to die in like the most ridiculous scenario where I can't do anything. And it was a really awful experience that, again, like I said, will stay with me. And I think the way you describe that, acceptance of that is fine, but you want to at least feel like you're going to go down doing what you want to be doing.
There's a big difference.
I know that things can happen. This one was just like, it was such a frustrating feeling to feel having no good options. And again, I'm lucky because I walked away from that unscathed and it stayed with me as a lesson. but it's an awful feeling, and not like when you're like, hey, I know I might not come home, and that's okay, because I'm gonna go do what I want to be doing. This was a little bit different for me, and I didn't like it, and fortunately never felt it again. And I will do everything I can to not fall into that trap ever again.
Jeez. People are going to hate me for this, but I do have to get you out of here on time, and I will. And
I'm not talking way too much, man.
No, this is great. So we're going to miss out on a lot of the F-22, F-35, like those little things. Yeah. I wanted to ask you though, coming out of this experience in Ramadi, again, scary, right? Like life altering.
Yep.
Some people will say they almost get addicted to that. Was it hard for you to leave that behind? No.
Nope. Not even a tiny bit. Nope.
I'm out.
Not even a tiny bit. And I joke with Jocko and Leif about it all the time, is that was the best year of their lives. They were SEALs doing the ultimate SEAL thing. They were an incredible unit, just an unbelievable experience. Obviously, they had real challenges and loss, and I don't mean to diminish that, but they were doing what they wanted to do at the height of the time to be doing it. I had no problem high-fiving, love you guys, see you later, right back.
Give me my helmet.
And I'm never coming back. And yeah, that led me down the path of, I went back to an F-18 squadron. I deployed. I did some jobs. I got lucky enough. I got Raptor, and all those things all reveal themselves after that time. But not even for a second do I look back and think I'd want to do it again or any one day longer. Certainly, it's a memorable thing, but make no mistake, I was an absolute fish out of water in an environment that I certainly reveled in while I was there, like, because I knew it was a valuable, important thing. But I wanted to be in an airplane that whole time. And I was thankful to be able to come home and get back to that, and don't miss that at all. Fond experience, great experience. Thank God I was with those guys who helped me and protected me. And thank goodness it gave me a path to go back with them. But no issues putting that
See you later. Oh man, I bet it gave you some kind of appreciation the next time you're in the cockpit talking to some guy on the ground.
100%. I thought when I left Top Gun, that's the best I was ever going to be. My perspective as a pilot was so much broader, having been a ground FAC.
Yeah.
You know, when I'm controlling Type 1 gun runs, strafing gun runs, you can't not see the world differently the next time you get back into a cockpit. And I know I went way too long, and I apologize.
No,
but I think this is a great place even to wrap it up, even on the flying side with that comment, because the apex of my career was that FAC tour. And I went on to fly Raptors for 4 years. I got to command an Air Force, the Raptor division of the Air Force as a Marine. I was the first pilot flying F-35s, first operational pilot in the world to fly the F-35B. That FAC tour was the apex of my career in terms of the influence it had on my life. Those other things were amazing. If you ever want to talk some other time, happy to. But that's the seminal moment in my life. For all the goodness and all the sorrow and all the loss, that was the moment in my life, that experience that mattered, that I will look back on and say was by far the most influential. Was flying those fighters was a blast. But that's the place for me. I'll say that's where I'll go to forever in terms of memories of what I did in my combat experience, for sure.
Yeah. Well, at some point, you know, if you'll have me back, I would love to talk some more about the like there's a whole half of a career we haven't even touched on, but I did want to touch on Echelon Front, right? Yeah. Like you're at a premier leadership development institution, I would say. Obviously, everyone who listens to this knows who Jocko is, has probably read the book. Yeah. Would just love to hear like what you're doing there, Dave, and kind of what you've seen in this space.
Yeah. So I was fortunate enough, stayed connected to Leif. They came back, you know, they were a SEAL team based out in San Diego. I was still in Miramar. And so, you know, did a couple of post-deployment parties with those guys. And we were close. We were, every story in that book.
You can't not be.
You can't not be. And I was so fortunate, and such amazing guys. Leif and Jocko, and like I said, everybody knows Jocko. He's an authentic as a human being as you'll ever meet. There is no like fake other behind the scenes Jocko. He is an authentic human being in every way. And he is a genuine human being, and he and Leif are the real deal. And so 10 years later, you know, I've done all these cool things. And I was telling you, you know, went to Johns Hopkins, got my master's. Leif calls, and I'd just because this is the way that things work. I had decided to leave the Marine Corps. I was selected for colonel. I was about to get promoted to colonel. I had been selected for command. I was going to go back to command another F-35 unit. And I ended up, right before promoting and taking command, I ended up declining command, declining promotion, submitting for retirement all in the same day. Big decision with no jobs. I just said, I need to go do something else. I get on the bus. I'm leaving the Pentagon. Leif Babin calls me that day, and says, hey, we wrote this book, and I knew about the book. The book is starting to take off. This is August of 16. He's like, I think there's a potential that this company we started, Leif and Jocko, or Jocko and I started, could go somewhere. Why don't you think about joining us? And I'm like, bro, we talked a little bit, but like over the phone handshake deal, like I'm in. So it's Leif, Jocko, and then me and JP Donnell. There's 4 of us back in 2016. We start teaching, and it's all Leif and Jocko's work. I get no credit for this. I'm just literally one of the instructors teaching it. But we start doing this thing with Echelon Front. And here we are 7 years later. It is the premier leadership consultancy. We have been able to reach, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people have read the book. What Jocko and Leif did is they took all the lessons and they captured them in a way that people can use them in their lives, not just their business lives, but their personal lives. And I get to be a part of that, man. I get to teach and help facilitate that experience. And you want to talk about giving meaning to Chris not coming home. You want to talk about giving meaning
that's
to
a great,
Mark and those guys
call.
not coming home. I get to contribute to people's lives getting better on their behalf. Echelon Front's the best thing that ever happened to me. Those guys are incredible. And what we teach works, and it makes people's lives better. And I am so lucky to be part of that and to get to teach the leadership that we learned from there, and that Leif and Jocko chose to capture and put it in that book, Extreme Ownership. And then beyond that, this leadership consultancy, what Jocko's doing and what we get to be a part of, it's amazing. It's amazing.
I can only imagine some of the, I don't know, customers or the people you're teaching have to be also pretty impressive in their own right in business. I'm sure you work at different levels, right? But some of them I'm assuming are heavy hitters. I'm not asking for names or anything.
No, and that's okay. And
being around
it's every industry, every level of leadership, every sector you could possibly imagine, and we're talking about we're talking like the biggest companies in the world at the highest levels, to companies that you have never and will never hear of in the smallest 10, 12 person startup and everything in between, because the leadership principles that we teach are universal. If you apply the principles, they apply everywhere in your personal and professional life, and they make your life better. And you could be the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company or the one-man CEO of a startup. If you apply that in your life will get better. If you take ownership of your problems and don't relinquish the control, you can contribute to the solution, and it will improve your life and the life of the people around you. And it works everywhere. And we've been fortunate enough to have that book resonate across every spectrum of leadership in every capacity in every industry. And we get to do that every single day. It's unreal.
Love that. I'm going to ask you 3 more questions and I will get you out of here on time.
No, you're good.
So these are questions I try to ask everybody.
Man.
No, this is great. So the first one is kind of taking you back to some of the tougher moments, but the most courageous thing that you saw in your time, and it can be leadership, physical, mental. What comes to mind for you?
The story of Mark pushing people out of the way in the line of fire. The story of when the first shot came out on the rooftop of Cop Grant, and Chris pushing a Marine down to protect him from sniper fire, and him putting his head up scanning, and those type of things, that these selfless behaviors that I got to witness, not because they were told to do it or they were outranked or they were obligated to, out of a sense of love and relationship for the people around them. What people are willing to do for each other when they care about each other is miraculous. And to be quite frank, I was the beneficiary of that far more than I was the contributor of that. But you would get to see things almost routine where people would expose themselves to protect others. Having and getting to see that will certainly stay with me forever. And certainly the closest one for me is Chris in a selfless way, protecting someone else so he could be the one exposed to try to find out what was going on that cost him his life. Hard to consider anything else. And the guests you've had on and the stories that I've told, I know that is a quality that I know it's rare, but we got to see that a lot. So it's a pretty miraculous thing what people are willing to do for each other. And I got to see that.
Then thank you for saying that. I mean, yeah, I'm getting chills just listening. This question is a little more lighthearted sometimes.
Good.
Sometimes not.
We need some of that.
So this, and you might go two ways with this, with the air and the ground experience you've had. Was there anything that you carried with you in combat that you just wanted to have on you when you were downrange that had sentimental value, something that somebody gave you, good luck charm, anything like that?
No, not really. I know this sounds awful, but I'm a little bit devoid of sentiment, and I'm not superstitious. I'll only counter that with a validation that, and it was a really interesting thing for me to think about after the fact, because I'd just gotten engaged, just gotten married, just left. It was very reassuring, if that is the right word, to know that when I had my moment, everything in my body went back to my wife. And the thought of her, that is what I carried with me. And the fact that I walked away from that experience that I told you about, knowing she was the last person I thought of, it made the cliche real. And it's a very powerful thing to me to almost validate, like, I definitely am with the right person. I definitely love her, because when things were coming to an end, I didn't go anywhere else in my brain. I went back to her. And I think that meant I was carrying her with me in the right way. But I don't have like a 4-leaf clover or anything like that. I didn't have anything like that. But I had her. So
I love it. That's well said. Because I guess in the other circumstance, if you were thinking of someone else, then maybe you got to reevaluate your life choices.
Or thinking of myself, like, this isn't fair to me, or my cool car back home. It was all about her. So
maybe you were like, some other guy's going to be driving my Corvette with my wife in it if I don't get out of this thing.
Totally, man. Totally.
All right. Last question that I ask everybody. As you look back on those moments and the ones we didn't even talk about, the sacrifice, what you witnessed, what you experienced, would you go back and do that again?
Yeah, in a heartbeat. I made the joke of, like, when I left, I was done. If you were to ask me, first of all, if you were to ask me if I could recreate my career, I couldn't do it in a billion tries. I got so lucky. So many things happened beyond my control that allowed me to do these things. So many things beyond my control. Anybody that has a successful career and takes credit for it is crazy, because too many things happen, too many opportunities. But if you were to say you can go live that again, I would do all of it in a heartbeat. Even the worst days I would do again.
That's well said, Dave. I got nothing else to ask you, man. Is there anything you would suggest? We'll have links to the book, Echelon Front. Anything you'd like to leave people with? No,
Echelon Front, that's where you should go. And Jocko and Leif, what they created, me getting to be a part of that's, I think, where the credit is due. Obviously, in the end, if anything I say helps people think about what they're doing, that's all we're trying to do. And the validation of that is, like I said, all we're trying to do is give meaning and value to the loss and the sacrifice by helping people live their lives better. And in a lot of ways, that can be a very hard thing. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to teach something that actually works. And I feel really blessed to do that. So go listen to Jocko's podcast, go read the book, go do whatever you want. But I think you've left it, and the comments you've made about that, I'm super grateful for that, and we appreciate that. And listen, I'll talk flying all day long. If the time is right down the road, anytime you want to talk about the second half of flying Raptors and being in the Air Force, and those were great times. I think I was just a little too long-winded in my other stories to get to them.
Nope, not at all.
It's been a blast, man.
It'll be good, because I'll talk to Intake about this cross-country flight, and then we'll bring it up here so we can disclose it. Maybe you won't let us.
That's not rated for public consumption. But he'll tell you the story, and then you'll have to tell me when he tells you.
Not safe for work. All right. Thanks so much, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, dude.
I hope you enjoyed that combat story as much as I did. Some of the aviators we've had on recently do not disappoint. It's really been special. It doesn't matter which branch of service, but they've really had some great insights. And because David knew Intake so well, I thought we'd start with some comments from that episode not too long ago with Scott, Intake, CartFit. And this is from Benjamin Lopez 7991, who's a subscriber. Thank you, on YouTube. And he says, I listen to all your shows, but I love the Aviator interviews. I'm an airplane nut, haha. And so am I. And it's funny because occasionally as we're recording, one of the other aviators would be like, I don't know, this is about to get, we're really going deep here. And you'll often hear me, sometimes we'll edit it out, but not usually. I'll say, no, keep going. That's why we're doing this. And I know a lot of you listening are the same way. So thanks for leaving that. And then this next one is from Ken Kelly, SWFL. It says, great interview. Still have my Blue Angel flyer somewhere that intake signed. Met Kieran O'Connor a couple of weeks before the accident. We had a very brief talk about the rival high schools we went to in Maryland. Thank you and your families for your service and sacrifice. So thank you for leaving those comments. I know it takes a little bit more time than just listening to the episode, but it means a ton to me, and it helps get these out to more people. I also wanted to say thank you on behalf of Listener 71, Average Listener 71, who left a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, said, amazing interviews. What an amazing podcast. There's so many stories out there that people have, and it's great that they can be told here. I can imagine that it's helpful to veterans to be able to relate to others and know that there is hope out there for treatment. For us average guys listening, I can say that I'm thankful for the service that you all did and glad that there are platforms like this to share your stories. I would also like to encourage females and medical personnel to share their stories, as I'm sure that they're interesting as well. For Ryan, you've got to figure out how to do the recruiting podcast. Something lighthearted would be great. Keep up the great work. And this is one of the things we've mentioned for those who have listened a long time. It just seems like there are so many discussions about how crazy things get when you're in the recruiter's office. From what you're promised, some of the backhanded deals that are served up, all coming from a place of trying to help the military, whether it's a quota or helping out some young man or woman. But I think that's what that's in reference to. If I can free up time, I will do that, because it's funny as hell when we talk about that. And then the last thing I wanted to do was just say a thank you to 3 new Patreon subscribers, Finley, Bruce, and Ewan. Thank you so much. You're supporting several efforts we have underway. One that I haven't shared with everybody yet that'll be coming out later this year, and I couldn't do it without y'all's support. And that also, I haven't called out everybody recently, but E. Bianco and John, thank you as well, and Stephen. All right, everyone, thank you for your time listening to this. If you made it this far, you're a real trooper. I appreciate it, and until next time, stay safe, y'all.